I know we don't want to have this conversation where we sort of beat up on the people who are behind these platforms, but it does make me increasingly nervous that one of them really wants to move to Mars and the other one has a legit bunker. Like, what are they preparing for?
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and social media is kind of going through a midlife crisis right now. Now, how does that work, right? Social media is only about 20 years old. Well, tech ages twice as fast, so it's caught up. Certainly, the owners of the major social media platforms are going through a midlife crisis, and I personally wouldn't know anything about that. But Zuck and President Elon are responsible for about 3 billion monthly social media users, and maybe more if Elon saves TikTok. What does saving TikTok even mean? And why are the people in control of what drives our online attention blaming everyone else for why things are so bad? I have no idea. But to help me answer these questions is award-winning podcast host and author Amber Mack, who literally wrote the book on social media, Power Friending, and she's going to explain all of this right now and hopefully curse at least once or twice, because Amber, you might be in the Amber Mack recording studio, but right now you are on the BetaKit podcast.
Hey, you know what? I probably will not curse. I have been a broadcasting professional for a really long time, and I have definitely not done a lot of swearing on air. So there will be no cursing. I apologize. But certainly I feel pretty amped up about this conversation of social media. Like you said, we're really 2 decades in. And I think all of us who have been around since the early days of social media, thinking back to day one of Facebook, and then a couple of years later when we saw the introduction of Twitter, all of us really believed that these were platforms where people could truly come together. They could build relationships. They were going to be kind places that offered lots of opportunity. Eventually, we saw, of course, there were some issues with safety. As more users got online, we had to start thinking more about guardrails in place on these social media sites, and how do you keep people safe, especially the younger generation? And now it feels as though we've kind of, come a bit of a full circle. And in 2025, we're seeing a lot of these guardrails that have been put in place that have been loosened up. So now the tech founders, there's only a couple of them running the big social networks of today, they are basically saying that safety is not a priority, speech is a priority. As much as I think all of us believe, if you're in the US, in free speech, and here in Canada in freedom of expression, the reality is that we still need those safety measures in place, but they have been deteriorating, especially over the past few weeks.
Yeah, coming in hot. I love it. You don't need to swear if you're going to come in like that. And not being a broadcasting professional, I'll carry the rest of the load here. But for people who aren't like familiar with your CV, like I know like you've written a book about this stuff, Power Friending. I say, I think through that first maybe decade of the development of social media, both from a at consumer and then like business professional lens, you were probably the like number one presentation speaker get across North America. And maybe like you did some international stuff, actually like walking people through social media developments, right? So like you're coming to this from a place of not only like, this isn't just two social media OGs looking around and asking each other what the heck's going on, which it also has been, but charting the navigation, that course of social media that you just articulated has been like a component of your professional career, right?
Absolutely. So I don't want to spend too long in this sort of historical moment of the show, but in the late 1990s, I moved out to San Francisco. I worked during the dot-com boom at a couple of different startups. Very soon after, because my background was in journalism, I started working on G4 Tech TV with tech guru Leo Laporte on Call for Help. We did hundreds and hundreds of shows where people called in and had questions about how to use technology. I did that for a couple of years and then was a reporter on City TV about what was going on in the tech space. Their first reporter who was reporting on technology trends, a lot of speaking, written a lot of books. those are outdated right now because so much has changed so quickly. But I think you're right. I've really sort of had a chance to report on these technology trends, both as a reporter, as someone who is commenting on these trends and speaking on these trends. But I do also want to add, also as a mom, right? Seeing my son grow up in this environment where he's now 15 years old and he's using these social media sites that I believed had so much potential to change our world. And now there are so many examples of how they are ruining it.
Yeah. Your children, like we were merely raised in the darkness. Your children were born to it. I think it's important. If anyone's wondering, I'm just on my side because I know I joke about this a lot. Again, not being a broadcast professional, might know me as someone who loves the dank tweet memes. But my previous history is one of being a social media manager and consultant for several companies, including formerly Research in Motion, now BlackBerry, being the global social media lead on a couple of these things. So this before we were pod besties, Amber and I were social media colleagues. So we're coming to this with I think maybe some technical understanding, as well as I think Amber, you articulated just a really a deep desire to maybe figure out what's going on and why this is happening. So I maybe want to you touched upon it a little bit at the top, but I want to give you an opportunity to kind of clear out and lay this out as you've seen it based on this. Just where do you think social media is at today? Is it even fair to call it social media? And like what are maybe some of the key moments and milestones that have led you to think that like how we got to here? And maybe we can talk about some of like the current news moments, because where social media is going is really up in the air right now.
It certainly is up in the air, and I am somewhat concerned about the future that we're going into in 2025. And I think one of the things that concerns me a lot, and I'm sure you feel this way as well, is the fact that we now have these social media sites, like I'm thinking X in particular, all the meta platforms that are really run by two people who are two of the richest people in the world. Now, they didn't get to that point by being nice and building community, right? You get to that point, especially in social media, when you see these platforms grow in 2025, they will grow because of engagement. We both know that engaging content that travels online tends to be hate-filled or full of controversy, right? The facts and the nice conversations that we might have had 15, 20 years ago, they aren't really the most popular things on social media. So I would say where we're at today, right now, is the fact that we have so few people at the top who are running these social media sites. But let's also add in the political element, right? Because just the other day, I was doing a podcast interview and I said to someone, I can't tell you how many times someone on social media says to me, stay out of politics, right? Like get back to tech. I mean, this happens all the time. But it is fair to say, especially over the past couple of years, that those worlds have entirely collided. Now the tech world and the political world have completely collided. And we've seen this over the past few months. Think back, for example, leading up to the US election last November, we saw Meta say that, hey, we're not going to allow political content anymore. We're going to kind of suppress political content. There was no news, of course, here in Canada. And then over the past few days, what we've seen is kind of the opposite. Okay, now we're going to open up the floodgates. We're going to have lots of political news. You can say whatever you want. We're going to actually loosen up on hateful conduct. And that all kind of lines up quite nicely with Trump becoming president again. So these things are absolutely intertwined, especially when you get both of those people spending so much time in the White House of the South, as they call it.
Yeah, I think you're talking about that Mar-a-Lago. I want to touch upon this before we get to the kind of bro oligarch consideration of this. And I know there's probably a lot of people who are watching or listening to this who might bounce off at that moment or hearing that we're going to discuss it in this way. I think stay with us because again, there's a lot to unpack here that might be worthy of consideration. I think it's totally accurate to say, Amber, that like the rage-induced response travels much faster than the slow golf clap of quality content. But I even want to get back to, the causality, because we're seeing a lot of these things tie together in a moment. And I want to make sure that we're clear on what we think the causes are and what aren't the causes, because the extent to which you would ascribe maybe like active changes by tech leaders to drive this moment versus did everyone on social media suddenly just get not nice? Like we decided that instead of just like sharing a photo of our latte art, we wanted to weaponize? Or is this a product of, to the point you made of it being impossible to separate the political from the tech because it's everywhere else? This is just like the whole world is on this stuff now in a way it wasn't in 2012 or 2014. And that means that all of the problems that we're currently dealing with in society are online. And maybe some of them are being driven by these tools that we're all online for. Like, is that a fair way to parse it? Or do you actually see a direct causality of like, this happened and it led to this and then it led to this?
Well, I think you're right in terms of more people being online. If you think back to the early days of Facebook, we know that within a few years of Facebook launching, they had about 300 million users.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're at the point as of 2024, they have about 3 billion. Also here in Canada, which I think is worth noting, last time I checked, there was a chart on Statista that there were more than 70% of Canadians who are currently on Facebook. So we have this massive penetration in terms of the number of people using these platforms. Now, I don't believe that people have necessarily just gotten worse and we're ready to kind of battle and we're angry. But certainly there are things politically here in Canada that have made people a little angry over the past few years. We have had, of course, the pandemic. People are absolutely struggling. All these things are real. We also have this sort of secondary layer, right? And that layer is the fact that if you were to use dehumanizing language on these platforms before Elon Musk bought X, or even as of last year in the Meta universe, what would have happened is that those posts might have been taken down or that person would have been reprimanded for their usage. But now, even over the past few weeks, what we're seeing more and more is that speech includes all speech. And that means even dehumanizing language that previously was not allowed. We know that Meta, just over the past few days, has actually said, hey, these things are non-violating now. If you want to make fun of someone for their sexuality or say they're crazy or they have mental health issues because of who they love, that's now okay. Now, I don't know why you would decide in 2025 that was the path that you were going to pursue on these social media platforms, especially with users as young as 13. But that's kind of where we're at right now. So I don't think it's hard to say. It's not just one thing, right?
Okay.
It is really this combination of things that have all kind of come together. And it is sort of this explosion in early January of 2025 that has led to these platforms, I think, being less safe for a lot of people.
Yeah. And obviously there's a political component to this that we're probably going to get into. But even at the platform level, you're tracking that growth number. And it is crazy to understand how many Canadians are on that level of penetration is greater than, like, I think of any other, like the number of people going to Tim Hortons. Like, we don't have any other like comparable data set of Canadiana than that level of penetration. Also interesting to know that those 70% of people can't read any news on that platform, which we might get to. But even just this idea of, like, we are referring to this stuff still as social media. You're talking about these platforms that have evolved and grown to such a scale that, Bluesky, which is a relatively new network, has just hit around 275 users. Absolute baby compared to some of these other platforms. But that driving force that you're talking about, that evolution, is one from these used to be platforms of conversation. These used to be places to talk and to share links to the web. It was a meta layer on top of the web. And now these are far more containerized. You don't have the APIs or developer products on top. Every platform other than Bluesky right now embraces some sort of like deprioritization of content if it links externally. Even a platform that you might consider as anodyne as LinkedIn suppresses algorithmically the exposure of content if it's linking off platform rather than photos, native videos, or what gift you got for Christmas can teach you about marketing and sales techniques. That's the key driver. Is it worthwhile just talking about whether or not we should be seeing these platforms that have been around for 20 years as the same thing, when the user experience and maybe the product feedback loop is so different because we're going to talk about TikTok at some point in this podcast, and that is like the end of the spectrum in terms of like Clockwork Orange, keep your eyeballs open. We're going to continue to just put stuff in front of you. But the places that actually used to be about, oh, someone just scored in the Raptors game, and here is my latte art, and like, what color is this dress? Have moved, and I don't think it's just an organic shift. Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely fair. And I think, really a lot of what you're talking about is the algorithms that many of these platforms are using. And the reality is that has totally reshaped conversations that we're having on social media, right? If the algorithms are set up so that they are promoting content that is a little more divisive or whatever that might be, again, this is going to change the conversation on these social platforms. Mm-hmm. This is why I've always sort of doubted this conversation that, hey, these platforms are like the town square. They are absolutely not like the town square anymore at all, because the reality is that the algorithms are deciding what people see. That would be like me going into the town square and saying, hey, you know what? I want to yell out all my feelings. But the person beside me is given a megaphone, and that sound travels further. We have the sort of similar situation on these social media sites. So I think that algorithms have absolutely changed this conversation in terms of these platforms. And essentially they're products, right? And they're products that have a goal of making money. And I think, hey, listen, I called my first book Power Friending. So I really believed, in this sort of very organic, relationship building online.
Organic, but self-directed, Amber. Still, even within that, it's like, hey, here's a tool that you can take advantage of. Amber Mack is going to show you how to your benefit, not, hey, here is the experience that you are endlessly trapped in. Here's how to survive it.
Exactly.
It's such a more inherently proactive mindset than what we would ever consider from these platforms right now.
Yeah, it's totally different. So I think, if I think back to way back in my journalism school days, and I think about one of the first stories that I wrote for my online newspaper, I wrote a story called Horse Hunting in Cyberspace. It was this story about people selling horses online. And I was really excited about the early days of e-commerce. For me as a journalist on the East Coast, someone who grew up in a really rural area, I was excited that I could kind of build my brand in this social space and have access to people and networks that I didn't have growing up in a tiny community in the middle of nowhere on an island that was disconnected for a long time from the mainland. And so I believed in the potential of these platforms. So I think you're exactly right. So much has changed. If I look at those rural communities now, back in my home province of Prince Edward Island, what are some of the challenges that they face in this age of social media platforms that are driven by, in many cases, algorithms of hate? We have communities of 500 people who now aren't able to have their city council meetings in person because there have been too many threats. We see that in these small communities, larger communities. I mean, I don't think we talk enough about the repercussions of what these platforms have done to each and every one of us in big cities, small communities, all across this country. And the second thing I'll add is, I know we don't want to have this conversation where we sort of beat up on the people who are behind these platforms, but it does make me increasingly nervous that one of them really wants to move to Mars and the other one has a legit bunker. Like, what are they preparing for? These guys make me absolutely so nervous, especially when it comes to the next generation and knowing they could hold the power for so much of this online discourse.
Amber, you're telling me you don't have a bunker? You didn't get a bunker last year like everybody else did? I got a good bunker guy that can help you out if you're looking for
Clearly,
a bunker.
I'm hanging out with the wrong people because most of my friends, they don't have bunkers. I don't know what it is.
This week's BetaKit podcast is brought to you by the BetaKit newsletter. Every Sunday, BetaKit's flagship newsletter serves up in-depth analysis and insights on Canadian tech and innovation news, piping hot and straight to your inbox. Think of it as a podcast for your eyeballs. With the BetaKit newsletter, you'll get crisp commentary on all the news you need, top Canadian tech headlines of the week, events you actually care about, the week's juiciest deals, and exclusive news from BetaKit's partners. Your inbox deserves better, and so do you. Stay informed on all things Canadian tech by subscribing to the BetaKit newsletter today. BetaKit.com/newsletter. and I think this is going to be just the way that this is shaking out. The back end of this conversation is going to be really focused on the people currently responsible for these platforms and the level of responsibility that they feel that they should place over their work. I just even want to get back to this, the duality of the experience of, because you're totally right in saying these are not town squares because you are kind of limited in what you can experience, but also everything is on these platforms now in a way that wasn't before. And that idea of everything being there, but you are siloed in your access, you're bringing up very much the small town community, local connection. I'll just even walk through this week, my experience of a couple different platforms to articulate this. Just before we were recording, I was on LinkedIn and seeing every single post being like essentially a sales pitch for something that person was relaying. And I'm just trying to stay up to date on conversations or business developments of companies and things like that. And I had that moment of like, this is making me sick. Why am I here? And it was like 5 minutes on LinkedIn. Earlier in the week, over the weekend, I was having trouble sleeping, woke up late, opened my phone and saw all of the content of the fires in LA. And it was, again, back to those early moments of, oh, hey, this is happening now. This is the water cooler effect. But my experience of that content was not the original posters sharing what was happening to them. It wasn't media outlets rapidly covering it or any like thoughtful discourse around it. It was people resharing or modifying the original content for their algorithmic exposure, separate from maybe like what was going on. And you're like, is that actually what's happening? And then I guess maybe my other experience with YouTube this week, somehow I clicked on something on YouTube, and YouTube is a very interesting one because you're like, well, that's not really a social network. But I would challenge you, for most people on their phones, like there's a creator economy there. They're producing content, and YouTube is very aggressive in showing you content after you watch something. If you watch a video on YouTube, it will then send you 20 of those videos the next day. Somehow I've gotten down in this poker hole that on YouTube Shorts, YouTube decided that I want to see people play poker hands all day, every day. And I can't tell it to give me the stuff that I've told it that I've liked. Finally, on Facebook, I think you made a really great point, particularly for Canadians who have had Canadian and international news as well, that doesn't show in Canada as well, removed from that platform. And knowing that every family member and friend over a specific period of time I'm connected to on Facebook, when that Canadian and international news was removed from that platform, the hole wasn't filled by the people that I'm friends with or family members and their posts. That's been algorithmically removed. Mm-hmm. It was replaced by the other kind of like low calorie trash content that you see on other platforms. I can't work hard enough to get Facebook to show me the personal connections that the platform was originally for. And like, I don't know, is there, we can go platform by platform, but do you think that's a fair description of like the experiences of these networks? So it's like, there's other stuff happening. You can't see it and you can't control it.
I think that's absolutely fair. I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with. And I think it's one thing for us to say that. We certainly, and I'm sure many of the people who are watching or listening to this, they have the tech know-how to understand how this works, right? Yeah. What I'd be a little more concerned about is the average Canadian, maybe even an older Canadian who doesn't understand how these social media platforms work. All of a sudden, they're being fed a whole bunch of content that's sort of shifting their view of the world, making them hate their neighbors. I mean, it is hugely problematic. And then second to that, I would argue that there is this narrative, okay, you know what, let's let the communities moderate these places, right? We've seen this in terms of community notes on X. We're seeing this in the meta world as well, in terms of them getting rid of their fact-checking teams. And I don't think that is the answer at all, right? I mean, it is hugely problematic to allow people and to moderate these sites. And it's not like Wikipedia. It works on Wikipedia because that's an online encyclopedia. You go to it to get information. It's very different on these social platforms that are meant for engagement to say that, hey, you know what, we're going to have this moderator and he's going to decide what's true and what's not true. That is not going to help anyone. So I think this issue is actually going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is a terrible analogy, but it reminds me a little bit, since we're here in Toronto, of driving on the 401. If you said to me, you know what, in the interest of freedom, we're going to rip out all of the traffic signs and rules on the 401, and we're going to let the people of the 401 decide what the rules are. Let them go out there and sort of shape what that experience looks like. I would never drive on the 401 ever again, because it would be so terrifying. So to me, I don't understand why we have all these rules in our physical world to keep people safe. I can't even go up an escalator without there being a warning sign of like, hold on to the railing. And yet we've been so absolutely terrified by these big tech guys to have any policies in place to ensure that these are safer online experiences that are deteriorating our relationships in the physical world and affecting our politics and affecting everything that we do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's for people not familiar. That is the Amberback equivalent of swearing. She's just laid it all out there and we're gonna dig into it. I want to even, knowing that something that always stands with me. Nilay Patel, the editor in chief of The Verge, who I think is very thoughtful on this stuff, and a former lawyer. So he comes at the policy and the legality stuff very, very thoughtfully. There's the product of social media platforms is content moderation. And the further a company falls astray of recognizing that fact, the worse the product gets. Before we get into the movement around, you know what? Drive yourself there across Toronto, that hall monitor effect. I just want to talk about you brought up your kids. You've written a book about keeping ahead of your kids online. I just want to get a sense, because we're talking about this as like grown adults who remember a time before and are, thoughtful about the future, hopefully optimistic, certainly concerned, and want to see a better, brighter outcome. In this 20-year window, we've seen a generation grow up with only this. And I want you to maybe just share, if you like, anonymize or just like your experience in navigating that, things that stand out, but then maybe also just tie it to what we've seen, this worldwide response with, I think, Australia leading the way and others looking, where they're just banning social media outright at a certain age tier, like smoking or other things that we don't want to happen to children. Can you just share a perspective on that before we get into the maybe there should be rules of the road?
Yeah. So I think it was in 2016, I wrote a book called Outsmarting Your Kids Online. Again, it's totally out of date. Do not buy it. But one of the reasons I wrote that book is I was seeing this growing issue with these platforms that weren't keeping kids safe, right? And people say, well, your kids shouldn't be on social media. Let's be very clear. Most of these social media platforms have a 13 plus sort of recommendation. That's their policy in place. And those people, I would argue, are still kids between the age of, say, 13 and 17. And that's also a critical age period. So I was very concerned about what was happening. At the same time, I had my son who was starting to use all types of technology. And so I decided to write this book. Now, one of the things I would say sort of in hindsight is that I put all of my focus of this book on the parents, like outsmarting your kids online. Here's what parents can do. In retrospect, if we look back again, it's been, almost 9 years since I wrote that book. I think that was a huge mistake because I think in this age of social media, it is impossible for the average parent to truly protect their kid in these spaces, right? When you know that you have these sophisticated algorithms, you know that you have companies like Meta that knowingly a few years ago was serving up, for example, more self-harm content to girls if they were looking for that type of content. It's impossible for parents to actually parent in that way and help their kids stay safe from technology when it's a totally dangerous place in the first place. So to me, it feels like the onus has to kind of shift to those big tech companies. And I'm very happy to see in Australia, even in the EU, I'm happy to see them step up and say, hey, we're not going to allow this. We're actually going to put policies in place. And I would argue as well that I'm disappointed in Canada as a country because we had an opportunity to also step up and say, hey, we need guardrails in place. You mentioned smoking, for example. You probably know a little bit about the history of smoking warnings in the world, but Canada was first out of the gate to actually put warnings on cigarette packages to stop smoking on flights. Just last summer, they announced they're putting individual warnings on cigarettes. So we were kind of first in that area, and we could have been out there and protecting kids online. But instead, I think we're really fearful of these big tech companies in terms of actually any type of regulation at the detriment of our children. So to me, it feels like we're at a crossroads right now where we have to decide if Meta says, hey, you know what? Now you're allowed to go and you can have content that is totally degrading towards people based on their sexuality, their gender identity. Are we still going to allow these platforms to say that we're 13 plus? Is that okay? And I would argue absolutely not. There is no example of any business in the world that would be allowed to operate and target children and say, hey, but when your kids come to our place, even if they're 13 or 14 or 15, we're going to let them scream at each other, make fun of each other, insult each other, threaten each other. It would never happen. So I don't know who's going to step up and do something, but we are so slow in this country to actually step up and keep those kids safe.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. And, the smoking correlation, is meaningful to me as someone who lost two grandfathers to cancer. From that, like just the reality of the grounded truth of like actual harms, which is why this stuff's important because it is so prevalent. What I'm hearing from you is an acknowledgement that as a parent who tried to give advice to other parents, you have fully acknowledged that this is beyond the scope and scale of personal responsibility. And like at a system level, at like a social level, this is beyond any one individual to be able to navigate. Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely. 100%. I think it's impossible. It would be like saying that, hey, we're going to let 16-year-old drives, even though they've never even if they haven't done driver's ed, if there are no rules around sort of a graduated license. It is ridiculous to think that parents are able to help their kids navigate these spaces when we know that these spaces have become increasingly dangerous. And this is the real issue. And I think at the end of the day, at least in this country, I don't know what you've seen, but my feelings have been that no one actually understands these spaces in the first place, right? Like there's actually just a whole lack of understanding among government leaders at all levels as far as some of the threats that have been in place for years.
At this point, it is like an abdication of responsibility to not be up on this, but then also maybe a question of like power and leverage. We had Rory Capron on this podcast before the end of the year. To talk just about a lot of things Google. He's an ex Google Canada exec. It was right at the time a couple of the major antitrust cases against Google were expanding, and before the Competition Bureau in Canada had shown up and said, us too, we're also going to sue. His main argument was that it was difficult to see a government like Canada have the leverage to effectively negotiate that. And if we look at the Online Streaming Act, the News Act, or other things, we have not seen that go very, very well. Google did capitulate for some money to news outlets. I just saw a story today that I think CBC is looking to hire 30 different local reporters from some of that. I don't know if that offsets some of the issues. I still don't think that bill was well constructed. Facebook just took its ball in its bat and it went home. And I think it's been long reported that in other times in which our government has looked to bring Facebook executives to Canada to answer some of these questions, they've just not shown up. I think, we'll also get to maybe like what's going on with TikTok. As you know, like TikTok might be gone by the time people watch this episode in the United States. What did Canada do? Canada decided to prevent TikTok from having an office in Canada, but is leaving the platform up, and that's being challenged in court. So there are half measures here that I think are really important. But I don't know if this is we don't understand what's going on anymore, or it is either these platforms and the people that own them, again, two of the richest men in the world, responsible for like over 3 billion people looking at this stuff regularly, and maybe more if Elon, there's been conflicting reports or back and forth reports about like whether there's an interest there to sell TikTok to him. The idea of saving that platform is really incredible to me. Air quotes save. But we're at this moment in time right now with like political will in the we have a leadership gap in Canada right now, right? We certainly have a opposition party that has leaned into, I think, some of the social media driven ideology or like social groups, whether that is like anything going on with like the trucker protests or like anything like that to great effect. In the United States, we actually have an incoming president-elect who owns his own social media platform and has been both directly financially and from an, I guess, advice, advocacy, mentorship, I don't know what they would call it when they're in a room together, standpoint, directly supported by Elon Musk, the owner of X, who has, while talking about free speech, has directly guided that platform towards his own personal interests. And if you question that, I'll note the only way to get algorithmic reach on X is to literally pay Elon for a verified badge. And there are 1,000 documented stories, pieces of evidence showing that if you run afoul of his interests, your account might just disappear, or certain topics are being deranked there. So while claiming to be the town square and be open to free speech, we're seeing a regulatory environment, a content moderation environment, still being driven by one dude.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very transparent to me, and in some ways, I listen. I don't want to go as far as to say I think users are being lied to in terms of this constant return to this conversation about freedom of expression or free speech. But the reality is, this is not that, right? I mean, it absolutely is not that. When you have these platforms that are making so much money and, like you said, deciding who gets to see what, having different levels of membership, amplifying content, shutting down accounts when they want to. I mean, in some ways, what they've kind of become is the exact thing that they didn't want to be. Elon Musk now runs a mainstream media site, right? And he is moderating it from the top down. Now, I don't know why more people don't call him out on that. I think it's pretty obvious to me. But I do think we have to start having these more honest conversations about what is actually happening. And, second to that, I would say, listen, there's a lot of people who are afraid to speak up, right? You've had these guys who, let's be fair, have been icons in the business and tech world for so many years. So it's kind of a difficult situation to say, okay, you know what, I'm actually going to speak up against this. And so we don't hear, I think, enough people actually having honest conversations about what these platforms are and how we can actually keep people safer on the platforms. If we go back to your conversation about things like the Online Harms Act here in Canada, one of the biggest mistakes that I think we've made over the past few years is that we've kind of muddied the waters trying to do a little bit of everything. If we here in Canada actually decided, you know what, we're going to have some type of regulation in place to keep kids safe, you would have bipartisan support in those efforts. People of all political stripes have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews whose lives are being impacted and ruined by some of these platforms. Yeah. So to me, it's like we missed the point on focusing specifically on the next generation and saying that, okay, well, maybe these platforms aren't for young people. And how do we actually clamp down on this? And it's just a total miss on our part.
Yeah, and we've done several episodes on, let's say, the good intentions and like just poor policy execution and incomplete policy execution. Like we're talking about, like that stuff is still not even done and baked. The fact that also a lot of that stuff sat under heritage, rather than maybe like a bipartisan cross-functional group of everyone who understood all the touch points that we've addressed this whole episode might have been better. But I want to go back again because we keep how should I say this, audience? Let me frame it this way. It is very useful and valuable to have a conversation about the reality of the fact that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are responsible for so much of this. And X's case, like total control, Facebook with Zuckerberg, it's like a long-standing Valley history, how he built his share class and ownership structure to never worry about governance ever when it comes to that platform. But I want to go back to the idea, of people responding to the idea, like just the idea of free speech. Can we just spend like a couple minutes on like where that sits relative to the reality of how this stuff is being executed, and maybe the gap between what's being said and what's being done. Because I see a lot of people, you were talking about like fear to speak up. It seems as though right now online, there are a lot of people who are afraid to go the other way, and they blame DEI, woke, fill in keyword elsewhere. But let's stick with the more moderate middle, is like very, very open or chilled and concerned by the idea that these platforms owned by companies running things we consider to be the public space, which is a flaw, controlling or dictating what's seen or what's not. And like a lot of really sincere questions about how limiting misinformation or disinformation, or maybe like unknown facts at that time when it came to COVID or other, political instances, even just like the multiple assassination attempts of Donald Trump last year. Like, I can't believe it was just like something like that just fly. Like we overlook that. That there are some really strong and serious questions about who's moderating this and how and what should be allowed. And that there is still more of a willingness towards like, yeah, I just want to be able to say what I want to say online. Like, can you carve out that inclination and how valuable or fair it is at a social level from the platforms for a sec? Like, is it worthwhile talking about free speech a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. But I do want to ask you this question. Has there ever been a time in history where we've had more places to actually express our feelings or thoughts on things? Right? Like, are we lacking places to go to exercise our right to speak?
There are places to go, but I think maybe this is kind of like this displaced pain that then people are associating and rallying around. All of those places that we have to go are corporatized and controlled by some company. Like, we keep talking about these metaphors to physical, open public spaces. And these are all just platforms owned by the world's biggest companies. So yes, you can go from YouTube to this to True Social. And if you get kicked off Twitch for saying something terrible or showing boobs, you've got that other Australian place that you can go to that they don't care. But they're all still like, we have not found a way to articulate the difference between true public space and the digital places that we all hang out. So I could see someone, and I don't feel this way, although when I articulated my experience on social media this week, maybe I do a little bit of like, I just keep going to these shitty restaurants, but I'm forced to go to these 5 shitty restaurants because there's no other way to eat. Yeah. And I can't farm it myself. Like, is there, that's where I think maybe this is like, does that resonate with you at all? You can completely call bullshit on this.
I think it resonates in terms of there being very few places to go. At the same time, I would say that there are also very few people who are getting kicked off these platforms for saying things that we would consider hate speech, for example. In fact, I think if you look at X, there are a number of examples of people who have been invited back on these platforms. Yep. YouTube, very rarely do they kick people off for saying things that could be considered, harassment towards a group. So my point is there are lots of places to go to freely express yourself. But the reality is, I think there should be guardrails in place so that you can't cause harm to other people or violently threaten other people. Yeah. I mean, this is just the basic rules in a well-functioning society. Just this week, I was writing in my newsletter, and I'm just going to look at some of the stats here to understand this. Because
lay it out for us.
Yeah, just so people do understand that, we're talking about something that is a very real thing. So the ADL did a report recently, and this is a U.S. report. We've seen similar numbers here. 22% of Americans experienced severe harassment on social media in 2024. That was up from 18% in 2023. The increase in physical threats went from 7% to 10%. We know that the LGBTQ plus community saw their threats in 2024 more than double online, many of these being violent threats. So it's not like we're making stuff up. Now, for a person who was in charge of these platforms, who saw things trending in this direction, I can't understand in a million years and call me a softy woke woman, but I would never say, hey, I think I'm going to loosen things up so there can be more of this. Right. And it's not a political thing of left or right. It's just a human decency thing. And is it fair to say that we have a couple of people, and there's probably even more than that, who are running these companies, these social media platforms, who are just indecent people? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. Like, if you go into the nitty gritty, I know Platformer did a really good deep dive on this in terms of the hateful conduct policies of Meta and how they loosened up on these policies. And, I hate to even repeat these words, but I think it's important for people to understand some of the things that, for example, that you are now able to say. So, for example, it used to be that you couldn't say something like gays are not normal or attack a group based on their sexual preferences. Now they've removed those limitations. Now all that stuff is okay, which we know leads to violence within these communities. Why would you do that, Douglas? Like, what would you be thinking in 2025 unless you wanted to get cozy with an incoming president who believed the same things as you, and this put you in his favor so you're going to make more money and go back into your bunker?
Yeah, well, hold that thought, because you mentioned the magic word here is platformer. For people who haven't checked it out, I think Casey Newton, noted journalist, and the team there, platformer.news, you should be checking those. They produced some, like, I think, given that their beat is like intersection of tech and policy, some of the most thoughtful and like Casey Newton is like the Amber Mac of policy stuff relative to the social media, right? So I just want to read the first 3 paragraphs of what he just dropped today, because I think it's relevant yesterday. This was January 14th. Because it's useful in just summarizing all the changes. And then I want to get back to your question as to why someone would do this. Because I don't want to avoid it. I've said some things online again that I will fully back up. But I want to make sure that we can carry people along with this information. So this is Casey Newton yesterday in Platformer. Last week, Meta announced a series of changes to its content moderation policies and enforcement strategies designed to curry favor with the incoming Trump administration. The company ended its fact-checking program in the United States, stopped scanning new posts for most policy violations, as Amber was just noting there, and created carve-outs in its community standards to allow dehumanizing speech about transgender people and immigrants. The company also killed its diversity, equity, and inclusion program. Behind the scenes, the company was also quietly dismantling a system to prevent its spread of misinformation. When the company announced on January 7th that it would end its fact-checking partnerships, the company also instructed teams responsible for ranking content in the company's apps to stop penalizing misinformation, according to sources and an internal document obtained by Platformer. So again, noting here and noting that there are studies that show that along the political spectrum, those on the conservative side respond more regularly and share more regularly mis and disinformation. I think we're looking at the meat of this stuff. Now, when you say why, Casey said it off the top, I think this is a very specific time following a US election and in the run up to a Canadian election, which we should talk about here, where you see a group of, even though they're the richest people in the world, blowing with the wind and a change in political leadership. And I want to note here, I'm on the record as saying that Mark Zuckerberg is my generation's greatest disappointment, and entirely craven his response to this, which is diametrically opposed to his response following the January 6th incident, the post 2016, like where they were on the pendulum for enforcing this stuff following the outcomes of previous US elections. I want to note that when he initially made these announcements, he blamed traditional media, governments, and fact checkers for the problems that his user base feels on social media when it comes to free speech, which is pretty incredible for like one of the most wealthiest individuals responsible for the platform that 3 billion people check every month, to say that it was their fault. I will acknowledge that I think Mark Zuckerberg's frustrations are sincere in like, hey, government got angry at us and forced us to testify one way a couple of years ago. So we did all this stuff that we didn't want to do. And now we have to do all this other stuff. I think there is a sincere frustration that like, people were not happy when we made these changes that we didn't like. So we're going another way. What I can't tell you is what actually Zuckerberg believes or cares about from any of the decisions that he's made, because they clearly point to a line of doing what is most necessary and politically expedient beyond all other things. I see no principle in any of these decisions. And I'll say this as someone that went on a podcast with Kara Swisher and made an impassioned argument at that time to allow Nazis to post anti-Semitic content and was roundly criticized for it. So I think this is a person, again, of my generation in a midlife crisis who is tired of sharing thoughts and feelings of things, still responsible for this process, and then dismantling the tools that they begrudgingly built for a new level of political pressure.
Absolutely. I think that's well said. And you know what? Maybe it's even more simple than that, right? Maybe it's the fact that he's going to make a lot more money, right? We never forget about, or we can't forget about the fact that I know Scott Galloway, speaking of Kara Swisher, was on MSNBC a few days ago, and he said that in terms of running the safety and security departments at Meta, it costs about $5 billion, right? When you go and decide that you're going to dismantle all of these teams that are fact-checking teams. Also, just recently, Meta announced that they're laying off thousands more people. I mean,
low performers.
He's going to profit intensely from this, right? And so at the end of the day, I think we can't forget the money piece of this conversation is that he's going to make an enormous amount of money. Is he going to really care about the fact that, hey, you know what, some young people were hurt along the way?
Amber, do you really think that it's given that he's like with me on Team Bunker and I'm part of a small collection of individuals, we all have our own bunkers. You got to get one. You got to have your own bunker in 2025. Do you really think it's the money consideration, given that this like $5 billion sounds like a lot? It hasn't dramatically impacted Facebook's finances or Meta's finances because they spend way more on dumb VR bullshit. There's also some great reporting that I'll reference here showcasing that they were outsourcing a lot of that stuff overseas in horrible working conditions. So these content moderators were actually suffering significantly from having to watch videos and posts and share to people being like murdered live on Facebook Live. Like this wasn't a, if you think Facebook was bad, this is Meta saying that's the best they could do and they're pulling the plug on it. I'm uncertain of the profit or the financial mechanism, knowing that Zuckerberg has complete control, knowing that Elon is the world's richest person. I'm wondering if it's just the air cover to not be hated or to be thought of as cool, which I don't say glibly. I mean very seriously, knowing that these are like, I think part of the problem here is that our democratically elected processes to regulate this stuff have completely failed. And we've just allowed two really, really rich dudes to run this stuff.
Sure.
And that these two specific rich dudes are in Elon. I don't even want to waste the time. Like, just go to see his tweets. He really cares about what you think about him online. And controlling Twitter and then turning it into X was the easiest way to control that conversation. Zuckerberg, like with his rebrand, his like dumb chains, his $100,000 watches and all this just seems to be like, yeah, sure. Again, I from my bunker, I couldn't tell. No, these are truly just like not really thoughtful individuals at this level, or who just don't care about this stuff, who are maybe care more about how they are seen and viewed than the outcomes or the outputs of the actual products that they build. Like I want to humanize them. But I want to do that to excoriate them.
Okay, so I'm going to unpack a couple things I think that you said. First of all, content moderators, fact checkers, kind of two different things in the context of Meta. And I say this only because we know there are a bunch of US-based journalists and organizations like PolitiFact that were engaged to do fact checking on the site. Those are legitimate organizations doing Pulitzer Prize winning work. Those really people. They're gone, right? And the editor-in-chief of PolitiFact said it best. And one of the things she said is that fact-checking is not censorship, right? This is just to ensure the quality of the content going out there in those channels. So just want to pick up on that. The second thing I will say is that we'll never really know the reason behind
Mm.
why they decided to go down these different paths. Do I believe that profit and political influence are two of the biggest reasons? I think absolutely yes. I think those still do matter. You say that, well, he's one of the richest people in the world, but guess what, Douglas? Mark Zuckerberg is not the richest person in the world, right? Would he like to be? Probably a
There's
lot.
always another dick to measure against, isn't there, Amber?
Yeah, there's almost like when you're in that top 4 people who are worth more than $200 billion, right? But he's not number one. And would he like to be number one? I would say that probably overwhelmingly yes. So I sort of think that ego comes into this. I think profits to a certain extent do matter. I think the political influence absolutely does matter. There's a bunch of things in play. But I would argue at the same time, I think one of the things that all of us have to remember is that arguably in 2025, these social media platforms are going to get worse with fewer guardrails in place, and they will lead to more issues in terms of physical threats, potential violence in the real world. And one thing that is especially important, I think many of us, is actually impacting the well-being and safety of our youth, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it just feels like when Mark Zuckerberg got up and he apologized to the parents about knowingly pushing more information that was going to harm their kids, some of whom committed suicide. When you go to get to the point of early 2025 and he removes even more of those things that were potentially keeping future children safe, and I'm going to swear here for you, it makes Mark Zuckerberg just an asshole. Don't know why, but I think there's a bunch of different things going on. And I'm certainly not afraid of calling him out because here's the thing, Douglas, there is a ripple effect to this assholery. And that ripple effect is that it emboldens other people to follow in their footsteps. Mm-hmm. And we see the repercussions of that. I see it among tech leaders that I've known for many years who want to go down that path.
I see you responding to Dan DeBow tweets.
Well, you see where I'm going, right? Like
Dan DeBow, recurring theme on this podcast recently.
Yeah. And so to me, it's like there is a ripple effect. There's a ripple effect here in Canada, And these are all choices that people make, right? These are choices that companies make as well. Many people have policies on their e-commerce sites like Amazon that say, hey, we're not going to allow hateful content. And that's just, something we've decided. They take down tens of thousands of stores that allow hateful content. Other people don't feel the same way. I think it's just really unfortunate we've gotten to that point where we have so many people running these big tech companies that sort of lack this kind of moral clarity and really don't give a crap about anyone else but themselves, even if what they're doing is impacting other people in such a hugely negative way.
Just going to pause here so we have room for the social cutout of that. That was great. I also want to note here that Amber, getting you to swear on this podcast is a career-defining moment for me. So I appreciate that. And you're 100% right that these platforms getting worse in no way limits their impact. It might actually expand upon it because, as we noted again, Nilay Patel of The Verge, if curation and content moderation is actually the product of these content generating platforms, failing to oversee that doesn't get rid of the mess. It allows it to expand. Like there are laws of physics that show here. I want to maybe close us off on two things, knowing that we've already gone longer than we said. But this is an important conversation. We've got to be a little bit forward looking here. There's two things that we haven't really touched about go forward, and that is maybe an antidote in Bluesky as being kind of an in-between between algorithmically driven, but driven by the user. Like we've conceded that the town square idea is dead. So they're like, you're going to be in control of your feeds. You're going to have the power. And then Madison McLaughlin for BetaKit reported this week on the Free Your Feeds campaign, where they're trying to actually a group of individuals, including, we've got Mark Ruffalo, we've got Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales, we've got Mark Sermon, who's the Canadian president of the Mozilla Foundation, Philippe Baudouin, who is the CEO of Numino, formerly Waverly, formerly a co-founder of Element AI, on this initiative trying to raise money to independently host the tech infrastructure on Bluesky to prevent billionaire capture. I'm interested in your thoughts on just like that approach, whether it will work, the idea that we got other rich tech people trying to raise money to protect infrastructure from even richer tech people. And then we've got to talk about, we've seen the US election. We know there's a federal election happening in Canada. And I think it'd be silly of us to not focus on our own home country and some of the stuff here. So dealer's choice, Amber, you've been an incredible guest and subject matter expert. Which horrible scenario do you want to tackle first?
Okay, so we should maybe end on a positive note.
Oh, okay. We can try that.
I
Never
do
occurred to me.
believe, I know, I think that it is true to say that maybe in the months to come, maybe not in 2025, but eventually we'll get to the point where we will have alternatives to some of these platforms that are better restaurants, to use your analogy, better places where we can spend our time and our money as well. Is it Bluesky or something else? I don't really know. But certainly I think you have a massive amount of a massive number of people who are open to this idea of using these other platforms. You know, for the first time ever, I thought, because I've been using Threads for a while, which is sort of a copycat site, of course, to X that Zuckerberg and his team started. I've been thinking, you know what, if Bluesky works out for me and I keep sort of getting, so much out of Bluesky in terms of great communities and content and those types of things, I'm just going to shut down my Threads account. Like, I really do believe that that is something that I will probably end up doing in 2025. And certainly I'm not alone. So on the positive side, we have a little bit of blank space for something better. All we need is sort of the courage and the money, people coming together to decide what that actually looks like. But I think it could be a tipping point. Do I believe that maybe some of Meta's platforms or maybe X is going to implode and burn to the ground? Probably in the coming years. I think that could be very, very possible. So there might be something better around the corner if I can pick that up. Second thing, just to end on the point about what's happening here in Canada, which I'd argue we don't talk enough about. You're thinking about our election coming up this year. So many people online worried about the future of this country, conversations about whether we should join the US or not. Again, ending on a positive note, I am very sort of relieved to see the number of people who have stood up and said, hey, you know what? I'm proud to be Canadian. I want to, support this country. I want a better future for Canada. So hopefully this is a tipping point in 2025 for our country as well. And we can have something better in the future.
Okay. Look at you putting a button on this thing with positivity. I truly appreciate that. That's the professional broadcast experience that I don't have, and the will and the optimism that I can't find. So I really appreciate you doing this. Coming on, and hopefully maybe we can have you on more in 2025, maybe even just to do an election specific episode once we know when there is an election. We would love to have you back.
Yeah, let's do it. I think, again, the worlds of tech, social media, politics, they've all collided. So there's always lots to talk about. And of course, I would love to come back. I'm a huge fan of everything that you do.
Oh, thank you. Until that time, which award-winning podcast could our audience find you on?
Well, I'm actually starting a new show with SiriusXM, which will also be a podcast called The Amber Max Show, a show under my own name where I'll get to cover lots of issues like we talked about today. So that should be live in February. And aside from that, I do a newsletter every Tuesday at ambermac.com/newsletter. You can follow along there, but lots to come in 2025.
Awesome. Okay, everybody make sure to subscribe so we know when the show launches and we're ready. Thank you once again, Amber.
Thanks so much.